In every era, across every land, countless lives have come and gone, leaving behind stories woven into the earth itself. Some were written in clay, some carved in stone, and many more whispered through the passing of generations. Here on Ages Rewoven, we wander through those forgotten paths. We explore ancient worlds, uncover long-buried memories, and follow the threads that connect civilizations across time. If you've ever wondered where our first cities rose, how people lived before history had a name, or how ideas traveled across deserts, mountains, and centuries, you are in the right place. This is a place for the curious, for those who find comfort in the quiet echoes of the past, for those who drift into sleep with the gentle rhythm of history. And tonight, on Ages Rewoven, we turn our attention to the Sumerians, the first great civilization written into time. Before history was written, before kingdoms, rulers, or recorded memory, human life was shaped entirely by the land. People moved with the seasons through grasslands, forests, and river valleys, where animals gathered. They traveled in small groups, not by choice but necessity. Food was temporary, shelter was temporary, and life itself depended on knowing when to move and when to stay. These early humans learned the world by watching it. They observed the path of the sun and moon, the patterns of rain and drought, the ways animals migrated. They did not yet have words for these things, but they understood them. Knowledge was held in memory, spoken by elders, repeated by children, and carried forward. Nothing was written, yet what mattered was not forgotten. At night, darkness surrounded everything. The stars stretched overhead in a vast silent sky. A single fire became the center of the world, a boundary of warmth and safety against the unknown. Families gathered close, sharing food, stories, and presents. It was here by firelight that identity began. Humans were no longer just surviving, they were remembering. Fire changed the course of life. It cooked food, hardened wood, reshaped tools, and kept predators away. More importantly, it allowed people to change their environment. With fire, humans began to shape the world instead of only reacting to it. Slowly, tools improved. Stones were sharpened, spears formed, shelters built from wood and hide. People learned to prepare food for later days, storing it to survive the seasons. These developments happened over thousands of years, not quickly, not dramatically, but steadily. Then came the greatest shift. In some places, people discovered that seeds, when placed into the soil, would grow. Farming did not begin everywhere at once, nor all at the same pace, but where the land was fertile and water was close, planting took root. With farming came permanence. Instead of wandering to follow food, people settled near rivers. Crops grew in cycles. Grain was harvested and stored. Animals were domesticated. Food no longer depended entirely on chance. Villages formed, not just as places to sleep, but as communities. Homes were built from mud and reed. Paths formed naturally where people walked. Pits were dug to store grain. Work began to divide. Some farmed, others wove baskets, crafted tools, or tended animals. Cooperation was necessary, and cooperation formed society. Over generations, villages grew into towns, houses clustered together, shared spaces appeared for meeting, trading, and discussing matters that affected everyone. There were people who organized work, settled disagreements, and guided decisions. They were not kings, not yet, but leadership was emerging. beliefs formed as well. People watched the sun rise and set, saw storms come and go, and wondered why. They marked time by seasons and stars. They imagined forces beyond themselves, spirits, ancestors, gods. Religion did not begin with temples. It began with observation, gratitude, and the need to explain the unknown. As time passed, some towns became larger and more complex. These were the first cities. We do not know the name of the first city. No writing recorded it. No stories survived from the mouths of its own people. What we have are traces, foundations buried beneath soil, fragments of stone tools, broken pottery, fire pits, and carved symbols whose meanings are lost. But archaeology tells us enough to understand the shape of life. The earliest cities required cooperation on a scale never seen before. Water had to be shared, land had to be divided, food had to be stored and distributed. People worked together to build walls, dig irrigation channels, and protect their resources. Organization became structure. Structure became hierarchy. The seeds of leadership grew into authority, and with authority came something else, the desire to build beyond function. Some walls were higher than necessary. Some buildings were larger than their purpose required. These were not accidental. For the first time, people built to be seen. They built to express identity, to create something meant to last. Yet nothing humans build lasts forever. Rivers changed course, soil grew less fertile, the weather shifted, trade routes moved, and slowly, over generations, the first cities declined. People left in small numbers, seeking better land. Homes were abandoned, walls fell, dust covered pathways. The buildings that once felt permanent returned to earth. A place that was once full of life became silent. For a long time, these abandoned settlements sat unnoticed. Grass grew over them. Wind and sand buried their foundations. The memory of the people who lived there faded completely, but ruins have a way of being found again. Travelers encountered strange mounds rising from flat land. They found fragments of pottery, broken tools, and stone carvings. They did not know who had lived there, so they created stories, tales of giants, gods, lost golden ages. They believed the past must have been greater than the present, yet the people who built the first cities were not supernatural. They were like us, inventive, cooperative, and hopeful. They worked, raised families, faced challenges, and imagined futures they would never live to see. They cared about being remembered. Today, archaeologists uncover their world, piece by piece. A shard of pottery shows how they ate. A hearth shows how they gathered. A broken tool shows how they worked. These fragments are small, but together they tell a clear story. Humanity builds, adapts, improves, and eventually moves on. Civilizations are not single events, they are processes, waves that rise, settle, and return in new forms. The earliest settlements gave us agriculture. The earliest towns gave us cooperation. The earliest cities gave us planning, leadership, belief, and shared identity. Even when a civilization disappears, its influence remains in those that come after. Modern cities with their lights, towers, and constant movement are expressions of the same instinct that guided the first builders, the desire to create something that lasts. One day, our cities may fall silent too. Their stories may become fragments. Future people may walk among our ruins and wonder who we were, and the cycle will continue, as it always has. Before history had a name, humans lived, worked, learned, and dreamed. They left no written stories, but they left signs, enough for us to see that they were not so different from us. And soon, in the land between two rivers, the first great city would rise. Its people would call it Uruk, and the world would one day call it the beginning of civilization. After the earliest age of humanity faded, and the memory of its first settlements dissolved back into the soil, the world continued on. Forests grew over abandoned places, rivers shifted into new courses. Time moved quietly, but the earth did not forget. Beneath every layer of dust, something waited. Between two great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, life began again. This land would later be known as Sumer. To those who lived there, it had no grand name. It was simply the place where survival was possible. Each spring the rivers flooded. When the waters withdrew, they left behind a dark, fertile soil that could sustain crops. The flood was both a blessing and a threat. It could nourish or destroy. The people learned to prepare, to watch the seasons, to read the river's behavior. They planted grain when the land was soft, and they harvested before the waters rose again. Homes were built from what the land provided: mud, reeds, and wood. Walls were repaired each season. Nothing was built to last forever, but life no longer depended on constant movement. Settlement was beginning. To live successfully here required cooperation. People worked together to dig irrigation canals, guiding the river where it was needed, and protecting their fields from being washed away. Canals, levees, and dikes became part of daily life. No single person could build or maintain them alone. Entire communities labored side by side, tied together by the land and the water that sustained it. The villages that formed along these rivers grew slowly but steadily. Names that would echo across thousands of years began to take shape: Eridu, Lagash. These were not yet cities, but they were more than camps. People returned to the same ground year after year, planting, harvesting, building, repairing, and living. The earliest temples rose in these places. They were small at first, simple shrines built not to impress, but to offer respect to the forces that shaped their lives. The people believed that the river, the wind, the storm, and the sun were alive. Their gods were not distant figures, but the world itself. The temples were gathering points where communities asked for balance, for mercy, for another harvest. Over generations, these temples expanded. Each generation added new bricks. Small platforms became raised structures, the first traces of what would one day become ziggurats. These temples served many roles. They stored grain, they organized labor, they hosted rituals, they became the centers of early community life. But the more people gathered, the more difficult it became to rely on memory alone. Someone needed to track how much grain was harvested, how much was stored, how much was owed. Someone needed to keep records of fields, agreements, and trade. So the people began pressing marks into clay. The earliest writing was simple, used only to record goods and transactions, but once symbols existed, they grew. Cuneiform, the script of wedges pressed into clay, became more than accounting. It became a way to preserve memory beyond the human voice. Stories, prayers, names, and laws were recorded. Writing allowed identity to travel through time. Among all the Sumerian settlements, one rose higher than the rest. Its beginnings were modest, like every other village. But its position near rivers, trade routes, and fertile fields allowed it to expand. Houses multiplied, canals lengthened, the temple at its center rose higher each generation. Erech became something new, a true city. Life in Erech was full and constant. Farmers brought grain along the canals. Potters shaped clay vessels in open workshops. Weavers stretched cloth on wooden frames. Metal workers hammered copper into tools and ornaments. Children played under the heat of the afternoon sun, while adults bartered and worked. The air carried the smell of grain, river water, clay, smoke and livestock. Sound moved through the streets, footsteps, voices, wheels rolling over packed earth. Erech was more than buildings. It was movement. It was repetition. It was memory that stayed in place. And within this city, a story took shape that would endure longer than any wall or temple. The Epic of Gilgamesh. It told of a king, part divine and part human, who struggled with loss, searched for meaning, and learned that even greatness cannot escape time. The people recognized themselves in his longing. Writing, once a tool of trade, had become a mirror. But as Erech gained strength, power began to shift. Priests who once guided the community shared authority with kings. Leadership became rule. Trade expanded. Canals extended farther. Erech began to influence other settlements. It was no longer just a place to live. It was the center of a region, yet the foundation of the city was still the land, and land changes. Floods sometimes came too early or too late. Some years brought abundance, others brought hunger. The same soil that had made the city possible began to weaken from continuous use. People worked harder, built more, reinforced walls and canals, added bricks to temples, as if more effort could hold back change. Erech did not fall suddenly. It faded slowly. A few families left first, moving toward more fertile ground, then more followed. Markets quieted, workshops emptied, canals filled with sediment, the walls cracked under the heat, the river still flowed, but the city that once depended on it was no longer there to receive its gifts, but the clay tablets remained. Buried beneath collapsed buildings and layers of earth, thousands of tablets slept. They survived long after wood rotted and bricks crumbled. When they were uncovered, thousands of years later, the voices of Erech returned. Not in myth, but in their own words. The accounts of merchants, the decisions of rulers, the prayers of priests, the laws, the records, the stories, the memories. Erech spoke again. Erech itself was gone, but the idea it created remained. The idea that people can gather, build, organize, and imagine a future. The idea that memory can survive time, if it is written. The idea of civilization. Every great city that came after, in Egypt, in the Indus Valley, in Greece, in Rome, carried something first learned here. Erech was the first city that understood time. It was the first place where humans tried to hold on to the moment and make it last. The rivers still move across the plains where Erech once rose. The reeds still bend in the wind. And if you stand there at dusk, when the air is quiet and the horizon glows faintly, you may feel something familiar, a presence, a rhythm, a memory. The memory of where it truly began. The first city, the first history, the first attempt to be remembered. Time did not begin with calendars or kings. It began with water, between the Tigris and Euphrates, in the land that would be called Sumer. The river was more than a source of survival. It was memory. Every flood carried the past into the present, laying down layers of silt that held the remains of seasons, harvests, and generations. The Sumerians believed the river did not simply move forward. It returned. It carried echoes. To them, eternity was not distant or unreachable. It was a cycle, the return of floods, the renewal of fields, the rising and setting of the sun. Life moved in loops, not lines. Death was not the end, but the beginning of another turn in the pattern. Each spring, the rivers swelled, some years gently, others with force that swept away crops and homes. Yet the Sumerians did not see the flood as punishment. It was the breath of the land, a reminder that the world continued with or without permission. When the waters withdrew, a layer of dark, fertile earth remained, soil that could feed thousands. The land demanded work, patience and respect, but it gave back life. They began to build canals, shallow channels dug by hand, then deepened, widened, and shaped to match the needs of the fields. Water flowed like the constellations above, forming patterns on the earth that mirrored the patterns of the sky. The same mud that coated their hands during the day became clay bricks at night. Homes, walls, temples and statues all came from the same substance. Earth was their medium, their craft, their connection to the divine. The gods they worshipped were not far away. The divine existed in the elements around them. Enki was present in the fresh water that flowed beneath the ground. Ninurtag was the fertile soil where seeds took root. Utu was the sun that rose over the horizon, warm but stern. To worship was to participate in the world, planting, irrigating, harvesting. Creation was devotion. They did not build towering temples to reach the sky. They built to anchor the sacred to the ground. The first ziggurats rose slowly, stepped platforms of baked clay, layered year after year. Each generation built on the work of the last. Standing atop these structures, a person could see the entire plain, the endless weave of fields and waterways that sustained life. But understanding the world required remembering it, and memory spoken from one mouth to another could fade. So the Sumerians began pressing marks into clay. The first marks were counts of grain and livestock, simple records that allowed fairness and planning. These markings grew into symbols, symbols connected into language, and language captured memory. This was the birth of cuneiform, the moment when human thought gained permanence. At first, scribes recorded only what was necessary: taxes, rations, temple offerings. But soon memory turned into story, and stories turned into identity. Hymns, prayers, and myths began to spread on clay tablets. One of the first and most enduring was the story of Inanna, who traveled into the underworld and rose again, a reflection of the fields that died and returned each season. Another told of Dumuzi, the shepherd who entered death and brought drought, only to return and restore life. Myth was not invented to explain the world, it arose from living within it. The river rose and fell, the fields lived and died. The stars moved in patterns that returned each year. Life itself was a cycle, and their stories reflected that. Among these stories, one would rise above the rest: the story of Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, a ruler who, faced with the death of his closest companion, sought immortality. He traveled to the ends of the earth and found Utlanepishtim, the survivor of a great flood, the one granted eternal life. But Gilgamesh discovered that eternity was not meant for humans. He returned home and saw that the city he had built, the walls he had raised, would endure beyond him. In this he found the only immortality possible, to be remembered. Uruk and the cities that surrounded it glittered with life. Their markets brought goods from far beyond the rivers, copper from the mountains, lapis from distant mines, timber from lands where forests still stood. Boats traveled up and down canals, carrying wool, grain, fish, and trade. With surplus came wealth, with wealth came leadership, and leadership became rule. At first, rulers were stewards, caretakers of the land and the divine balance. But over time, as cities grew, that stewardship hardened into power. The priest became the king. The king became the symbol of the gods, temples became monuments, and the cities became centers of ambition. Yet even the greatest structures were built on fragile earth. The river that nourished the fields could also choke them with salt. Irrigation, over generations, changed the soil. The ground that had once grown abundance slowly whitened, harvests thinned. The cycle that had sustained life began to turn. Prayers multiplied, temples rose higher. The people gave more offerings, more labor, more faith. But the rivers moved to their own rhythm, and when nature shifted beyond human adaptation, the cities weakened. Some were abandoned, others persisted but diminished. Sumer did not vanish, it transformed. New powers rose: Akkad, then Babylon, inheriting Sumer's cities, its gods, its writing, its mathematics. What began in mud-brick temples became the foundation of kingdoms and empires. The Sumerian system of timekeeping shaped calendars and clocks. Their geometry shaped astronomy. Their stories shaped the myths of entire civilizations. The river continued to remember. Flood after flood uncovered fragments of their world: pottery, bricks, broken statues, clay tablets, inscribed with names once spoken aloud. Archaeologists thousands of years later found these tablets hardened by accident, preserved by heat, sealed by collapse. And when they were read again, the voices of Sumer returned, clear and human. We lived, they said. We built. We remembered. The Sumerians knew something that every civilization learns eventually, that nothing material lasts, but memory can. The river carries the past forward. The clay preserves the voice. The story endures. What survived of Sumer was not its walls, its rulers, or its wars. What survived was the idea that to exist is to leave something behind. The river still flows through the plains where Sumer once stood. The reeds still whisper in the wind, and when the flood waters rise and fall, something ancient stirs beneath them. The river remembers. It always remembers. When the rivers that had once sustained the Sumerians began to shift and dry, the land did not forget them. The Tigris and the Euphrates had carried more than water. They carried memory, the memory of the first cities, the first temples, the first words pressed into clay. Even after the floods grew unpredictable and the canals cracked under heat and time, something of Sumer remained in the soil. The Sumerians had believed that to build was to remember, and memory, like clay, could be shaped again and again. Their cities faded, their temples eroded, but the world that rose after them was built upon their foundations. The calendar they crafted from the rhythm of moon and flood guided farmers for centuries. The laws they wrote into clay became the basis of legal systems long after their language vanished. Their myths continued to echo in new tongues and new cities. The Akkadians were the first to inherit this world. They did not arrive to empty land. They came to cities already ancient, fields already irrigated, temples already standing above the plains. Their king Sargon of Akkad would become remembered as the first great conqueror, a ruler who unified the lands between the two rivers. But even Sargon ruled using Sumerian tools. His scribes wrote in cuneiform learned from Sumerian schools. His administrators counted grain with Sumerian measures. His priests performed rituals drawn from Sumerian prayers. The world called it conquest. The land called it continuity. The Akkadian Empire rose, flourished, and fell, as every empire does. Drought, rebellion, shifting trade, and time took their toll. But when Akkad crumbled, the knowledge it carried did not. The memory flowed onward. From the dust of Akkad, Babylon rose, and Babylon did not begin as something new. It began as something remembered. The Babylonians built their temples in the shape of those that had stood in Ur and Uruk. They mapped the stars using methods first charted by Sumerian astronomers. They wrote their laws on stone as the Sumerians had written on clay. The famous Code of Hammurabi, praised as the birth of justice, carried echoes of older Sumerian principles: measured responsibility, recorded agreement, divine balance. Even Babylon's myths were retellings of Sumerian stories: the tale of a great flood sent by the gods, the descent of a goddess into the underworld, the hope of rebirth after destruction. These stories shifted in name and form, but their soul remained the same. Then came Assyria, fierce in war, relentless in expansion. Assyria built cities of stone and iron, but in their libraries, among their records of conquest, they preserved the oldest Sumerian writings. In the palace of Nineveh, scribes copied the Epic of Gilgamesh tablet by tablet, line by line. They did not do so to honor Sumer. They copied because they understood that something in those stories was older than kingdoms, something true. When Assyria fell, the memory survived again. Next came Persia, vast and organized, stretching from India to the Mediterranean. The Persian kings believed in a universe governed by balance, light and darkness, order and chaos, a belief that had already lived in the stories of Sumer. Their empire relied on law, roads and record-keeping, systems born from the earliest clay tablets between the rivers. Through each empire, the Sumerians lived on, not in name but in the structure of the world. Their language eventually disappeared. Their cities sank beneath sand and silt. Their gods changed names and forms, but the ideas they created continued to shape every kingdom that followed. The Sumerians were the first to divide the circle into 360 degrees, the first to divide time into 60-minute hours, the first to measure the lunar month and track the movements of the stars. Even when their voice was forgotten, the world still counted by their rhythm. They were also the first to ask a question that would echo across all of history: what is the meaning of life when everything must end? The story of Gilgamesh, the earliest great epic, was more than a tale of a king. It was the Sumerian realization that no wall, no temple, no city, no empire could escape time. Gilgamesh sought immortality and returned only with understanding that eternity lives in memory, not in the body. The Sumerians accepted that everything returns to the river. Their cities rose and fell. Their fields thrived and failed. Their gods changed names. Their stories changed languages, but the pattern continued. And in that pattern they found peace. When their own cities began to fail, when the rivers shifted, when salinized soil would no longer grow wheat, when trade routes moved and harvests thinned, they did not disappear. They transformed. Their culture became part of those who followed. The Akkadians, then the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Persians, all of them drew from Sumer. Each empire believed itself a beginning. None realized it was a continuation. The world remembered the names of conquerors, but it was the Sumerians who taught the world how to remember. When the last Sumerian cities finally emptied, when the wind blew through abandoned canals and broken ziggurats, the story did not end. It waited. Thousands of years later, archaeologists dug into the soil of Mesopotamia. They found bricks stamped with ancient seals. They uncovered the remains of temples that once touched the sky, and in deep layers of earth they found clay tablets, hardened by time, covered in wedge-shaped writing. When scholars learned to read them, the first voices of humanity spoke again. They spoke of trade, of harvests, of marriage, of prayer. They spoke of kings and of farmers. They spoke of floods and stars, and they spoke of the oldest question of all: how to live in a world where everything ends. The Sumerians did not answer with conquest, they answered with remembrance. Their legacy was not an empire but a foundation. Every city built with organized streets, every law written to govern fairly, every calendar used to measure time, every story told about the struggle between life and death. All of these carry the shape of Sumer. The kingdoms of dust and fire, Akkad, Babylon, Assyria, Persia, were not new creations. They were chapters in one long unfolding. Each believed itself the beginning, but each was only another turning of a wheel first set in motion in the reed marshes between two rivers. The Sumerians did not conquer the world, they became it. They achieved the one immortality Gilgamesh could not grasp. They lived not in stone but in memory, and memory endures. The cities were gone, but the clay endured. When the ziggurats crumbled and the canals dried into cracked channels of dust, when kings became names with no faces, when the temples sank into silence, one thing remained, the marks pressed into wet earth. The Sumerians, though fallen, had left behind the memory of thought itself. Across the southern plains, where reeds once whispered beside the Euphrates, wanderers came upon the ruins of Ur and Eridu. Beneath collapsed walls and wind-carved stairways, they found tablets, thousands of them, buried in layers of silt and time. The clay was hard now, baked by centuries of heat and accident, but the impressions carved into it were clear, a script of wedges, precise and disciplined, holding voices from a world no longer standing. Cuneiform had outlived the very language that first shaped it, and so began the second life of Sumer, a life in memory rather than stone. The Akkadians, who inherited the land, did not merely conquer cities. They inherited a world of records, mathematics, rituals, star maps, and administrative order. Their scribes learned to write, not through invention, but through remembrance. Their kings, including Sargon of Akkad, ruled through systems the Sumerians had already built. The empire that rose called itself something new, but it governed through the logic of Sumer. Even the greatest conquerors eventually become the caretakers of what came before them. When the Akkadian Empire fell, the knowledge survived, flowing into the city of Babylon. Babylon did not emerge as a break from the past. It emerged as a translation of it. Its scribes copied Sumerian tablets, line for line. Its priests used Sumerian star charts to track the heavens. Its architects studied the ruins of ancient ziggurats and built them anew in the form of Itaminanki, a great step tower that rose above the horizon like a mountain of fire-baked brick. The flood narrative of Utnapishtim became the flood legend of Gilgamesh. The gods changed their names, but not their personalities. The myths did not replace the old ones, they revised them. Beneath each new telling, the heartbeat of Sumer remained. In Babylon, the temple became something more than a place of offering. It became a place of study. Scribes examined the sky, as their ancestors had done, not to appease the gods, but to understand them. The stars were recorded faithfully, their cycles measured and compared. Time was organized into hours and minutes, the year into seasons and festivals. The circle was divided into 360 degrees. Even today, the clock ticks in Sumerian rhythm. Where Sumer had sought harmony with the divine, Babylon sought mastery over it. The priest became astronomer, the prayer became calculation. The heavens, once the realm of awe, became a map. Yet the pursuit was still deeply human. To study the stars was to search for meaning in a world that changed and forgot. Each mark on clay, a digit, a fraction, an observation, was an act of preservation, a way of saying we were here, we witnessed this. Wasum wis, wasum kabdeseshtero wisi and sia. In Babylon's libraries, scribes copied and recopied the old tablets. They did so because they believed forgetting was a second death. To be remembered was to live again. They remembered Enheduanna, the priestess of Ur, who wrote hymns to Inanna with a voice that still echoes through time. They remembered kings like Ur-Nammu, who carved law not as divine terror but as fairness written in clay. They remembered Gilgamesh, who searched for immortality and returned home understanding that remembrance was the only answer time would allow. But the more Babylon remembered, the more it began to believe that order could be perfected. Knowledge grew heavy, law grew rigid. The clay tablets that once held poetry and prayer filled instead with inventories, taxes and decrees. The human voice began to strain beneath its own systems, for knowledge, like empire, can harden. Still there were those who continued to wonder. In quiet rooms lit by oil lamps, scholars watched the sky not for omens, but for truths. They began to realize that the world followed patterns, not because gods controlled them, but because nature itself was structured. A new idea began to take shape, that the cosmos was not a mystery to submit to but a structure that could be understood. This was the beginning of philosophy. Ideas do not fade when cities fall, they go underground, waiting for new generations to uncover them. Assyria rose after Babylon, fierce, disciplined, relentless. Its kings built walls and armies rather than gardens, but even Assyria carried the inheritance of Sumer. In Nineveh, the Assyrians gathered thousands of tablets, not to erase the past, but to possess it. Among them was the Epic of Gilgamesh, copied carefully by scribes who understood that some questions outlive nations. When Assyria fell, its libraries burned. Clay tablets cracked, yet enough survived to continue the chain. Then came the Persians. Their empire stretched across deserts and rivers, mountains and plains. They believed in a universe of balance, light and darkness, order and chaos, forever locked in struggle. It was a refinement of the old Sumerian understanding that life was a cycle, not a line. The Persians ruled through system, law and stability, the same principles born in the first cities between the rivers. But with each new empire, the original spirit began to fade. What had once been humility before nature became ambition over it. The question shifted from how do we live with the world to how do we govern it. Yet beneath the shifting beliefs, beneath the changing languages and crumbling walls, the foundation remained the same. The Sumerians had created a way of thinking about time, order, number, memory, and meaning. That way of thinking became the blueprint for civilization. In Babylon, priests observed the stars. In Assyria, kings collected archives. In Persia, rulers governed with structured law. And beyond Persia, far to the west, in a rocky land of scattered villages, people would one day take these same questions and build something new from them. The Greeks would call it philosophy, but the first philosopher may very well have been a Sumerian farmer watching the river rise and fall, asking why. When Alexander the Great marched across Mesopotamia, he was not just conquering territory, he was walking into the oldest library in the world. In Babylon he found mathematical tables, astronomical records, maps of the stars, and stories older than any told in Greece. The ideas of Sumer flowed into Greece, then into Rome, then into the world. The Sumerians had written so that time could not erase them, and time did not. Their cities returned to dust, their temples broke apart, their gods faded into symbols, but their questions endured. What is the meaning of life in a world where everything ends? How do we store memory so it survives us? How can we measure the world and understand it? How can we live together justly? No empire ever answered these questions permanently, but each one carried them a little further. The Sumerians had once written to remember, their descendants wrote to understand. Between those two acts, memory and thought, civilization was formed.
The world no longer spoke the Sumerian language, but it spoke Sumerian ideas in every law, every calendar, every story of gods and men. The clay remained, the questions remained, the memory remained. Even now, in quiet museums, under glass and dim lighting, their tablets wait, wedge-shaped impressions, small and patient, holding the reflection of the first human mind that refused to be forgotten. The Sumerians did not conquer the world, they became the foundation on which the world was built, and in that they achieved the immortality Gilgamesh sought. Not life without death, but life that continues in memory.
When the last fires of Sumer faded and its temples sank beneath the settling sands, the world did not fall silent. The rivers that had once nourished its cities carried memory downstream, the soft rhythm of reed pens pressing clay, the hymns once sung at dawn, the measured breath of a civilization learning to name itself. From that memory, new cities rose: Akkad, Babylon, Nineveh. None of them were beginnings, all were inheritances. Those who built Babylon believed they could outlast time. The Sumerians had raised their cities from mud, a material meant to be renewed and reshaped each season. The rivers rose. Babylon chose stone and fired brick instead. Its walls and temples were made not only to stand but to be seen, to declare that this city would not be swallowed by the river or the sun. The Ishtar Gate rose in deep lapis blue, adorned with lions and dragons marching in rows. It was more than a triumph of craft. It was a statement: we will not fade. The gate was an entrance not just to a city but to an idea, that humanity could build something immune to forgetting. Yet beneath the gleaming walls, Babylon still carried Sumer in its bones. The scribes pressed cuneiform symbols into clay just as their ancestors had done. They recorded trade, laws, stories, and observations of the stars with the same careful discipline. The gods had new names, but familiar shapes. Enlil became Marduk, Inyana became Ishtar. The old order of heaven, earth, and underworld remained unchanged, preserved through tradition even as the cities changed around it. The knowledge that had first arisen beside Sumer's rivers matured in Babylon's libraries. Scholars observed the movement of Venus, the star once sacred to Inanna, and recorded its cycles with remarkable precision. They charted eclipses. They developed mathematics using the same base 60 system that had once been a farmer's tool for measuring grain and canal depth. Invention in Babylon was rarely new. It was refinement, a memory sharpened, but ambition has a cost. In Sumer, knowledge had been a dialogue with the world, an attempt to understand the forces that shaped existence. In Babylon, knowledge became power. Kings invoked the gods to justify rule. The ziggurats rose higher, not to honor the stars but to claim proximity to them. Each brick stamped with the seal of a king carried an unspoken declaration: this will endure because my name is upon it. The river disagreed. The Euphrates that had fed Sumer's fields now coursed past Babylon's walls. It continued its slow, indifferent work, depositing silt in some places and carving away land in others. Where Sumer had worked with the river, Babylon demanded control over it. Canals expanded outward. Irrigation systems reached farther. Every expansion required more labor, more order, more rule. The balance that had sustained the first civilization began to strain. Still, Babylon shone. Priests climbed the ziggurat of Itamanki at sunrise, reciting hymns that carried the structure of older prayers. At night they watched the stars from temple platforms, tracing the same constellations the Sumerians had charted long before, but the tablets had changed.
Where once they held myths of creation and hymns of gratitude, they now recorded decrees, tax lists, legal proceedings, and omens used to justify state decisions. The written word had become administrative, regulated, heavy, yet some still remembered. Quiet scholars in temple corners copied ancient texts long past relevance. Some preserved hymns to Inanna even when the official priesthood invoked Ishtar. Others studied the ruins of Eridu, believing that understanding the first city might guide the fate of the present one. They knew that civilizations rise not only by building but by remembering what once held them together. As Babylon reached its greatest heights, its gardens blooming and its towers rising into the heat of the sky, its foundations had already begun to shift. Soil exhausted by centuries of farming yielded less, canals clogged, workers grew tired, kings demanded more than the land could give. The eternal city's brilliance hid an imbalance beneath the surface. Assyria rose in the north, powerful and relentless. To its rulers, Babylon was not sacred, but strategic. Fire and conquest swept through the land. Babylon fell, rose and fell again, each time rebuilt and each time diminished. Yet even the conquering Assyrians could not escape memory's pull. In Nineveh they constructed vast libraries filled with tablets taken from Babylonian and Sumerian archives. One tablet contained the Epic of Gilgamesh, a story older than any empire, preserved because it spoke to something every empire learns. All cities fall, and only memory endures. When Assyria collapsed, Persia ascended. Cyrus and his successors ruled through administration rather than terror. Their empire relied on roads, measurable systems, and law principles that traced back to the first cities of Sumer. Yet even under new rulers the city could not escape time. The river shifted its course, trade moved elsewhere, agriculture weakened, and Babylon, like Ur and Eridu, began to fall silent. It did not collapse in a single night. No tower suddenly broke. No fire consumed every street. Instead, the city slowly exhaled. The ziggurats softened, gardens dried, the great gate faded beneath sun and sand. Words carved in stone became unreadable to those who passed them. The eternal city grew still, but the silence was not empty. Beneath layers of earth fragments remained, glazed bricks, shards of pottery, tablets filled with numbers and prayers. They waited for someone to find them. When they were uncovered, the voice of the city returned, not the voice of Babylon alone but of Sumer speaking through Babylon, the voice of the first people who tried to understand themselves. Civilizations do not end, they transform. Each one leaves questions for the next to answer. Each one builds on the memory of the last, and the memory of Sumer, carried first by clay, then by stone, then by story, is still alive. The river flows, the clay remembers, the cities rise, and through them, the first dream continues. Eternity was never in the bricks, it was always in the memory.
The story of empire begins not in gold, but in dust, long after Sumer's rivers faded into silence, and Babylon's towers lost their shine. A new people rose from the northern plains, a land of cold winds and harsh stone, where survival required obedience more than faith. They were the Assyrians, and where the southern kingdoms had sought harmony with the divine, the Assyrians learned to rule through fear and discipline. Their first kings were soldiers rather than dreamers, men shaped by hardship who believed that order could exist only when enforced with strength. From the city of Ashur, set upon the Tigris, they built what many consider the world's first true empire. Their temples were few, their rituals brief, but their armies marched farther than any before them. To the Assyrians, the gods were not gentle creators but stern overseers. Ashur, their chief deity, represented kingship and conquest. His winged symbol appeared on every wall and every campaign, a reminder that the king ruled by divine severity. Where Sumer had built to honor creation, Assyria built to command it. When their armies marched, the ground trembled beneath bronze helmets and chariots that lined the horizon like gathering storms. They fought not for plunder, but for control. They believed that every city, every people, and every god could be bent to their will. In the ruins of older civilizations, they carved their message into stone, obedience or destruction. Walls that once held hymns now displayed decrees. Palaces that once hosted priests now echoed with generals. When a city resisted, it was leveled and rebuilt in the Assyrian image. When rulers withheld tribute, their statues were toppled and their names removed from history. The cities of Nineveh, Kulu and Dar-Sharukin rose with impossible ambition. Stone reliefs filled their halls, showing kings towering above bound captives and defeated nations. These carvings were precise and cold, cruel in their beauty, and each one served as a warning. Yet beneath the sharp edges of this art lay the lingering memory of Sumer. Assyrian scribes continued to press cuneiform into clay. Their priests invoked ancient gods under new names. They did not erase the past, they repurposed it. They rebuilt the achievements of Sumer and Babylon with harder stone, stronger walls and iron weapons. But strength came with a cost. The Assyrian king was no longer simply a ruler. He became a living god, the axis around which the world revolved. His word was absolute, his anger was divine. In the shadow of his throne, no one dared mention failure. Generals bowed, priests obeyed, builders worked beneath the crack of whips to raise monuments to his glory. Yet the weight of the crown grew heavier with each victory. Every conquered people required tribute. Each rebellion demanded suppression. Roads stretched across deserts and mountains to feed the heart of empire. But those same roads carried whispers of resentment. The Assyrians had forced the world into their order, but like water cupped in a fist, control began to slip away. Even their greatest kings sensed the tremor beneath their achievements. Sennacherib, who rebuilt Nineveh into a city of unmatched splendor, declared that he had created a palace without rival. Canals brought water from distant hills. Gardens bloomed in the desert. The streets shone with torchlight. Yet within those magnificent walls, his own sons plotted his death. The crown that promised eternity brought only suspicion and fear. Peace for the Assyrians was merely the pause between campaigns. Their armies expanded the empire from the mountains of Urartu to the deserts of Elam. Tribute flowed in, gold, ivory, spices, prisoners. But the more they ruled, the less they understood why. Sumer had written hymns to creation. Babylon had written for memory. Assyria wrote for itself. The divine had been replaced by authority. The empire itself had become the new god, and so the cycle deepened. The civilizations of the rivers had always lived in rhythm, flood and renewal, rise and decline. Assyria broke that rhythm. It created an empire without breath, victories without reflection, conquest without end. Rebellions flared at the edges of their world. Egypt refused tribute. Babylon rose again in defiance. Mountain tribes struck from the north. The armies that once marched with pride now marched with exhaustion. Soldiers muttered about hunger and gods who no longer answered. Then came the omens. The sky darkened with eclipses. The stars flickered in unnatural patterns. The river rose higher than memory. Priests urged days of mourning, but the king dismissed them.
He had gathered knowledge from every corner of his empire, yet refused to learn the lesson that echoed from Sumer onward, that no empire survives when it forgets humility. When the Medes descended from the northern hills and the Babylonians surged from the south, it was not a simple war. It was the ending of a cycle that Assyria had tried to break. Nineveh, fortress of the world, was surrounded. For 3 months the city burned. Flames consumed the palaces whose walls had once declared the kings immortal. Stone reliefs of lions and captives melted beneath the heat. The winged symbol of Ashur shattered and fell. When the smoke cleared, the empire that called itself eternal was gone. Yet even in ruin, Assyria continued to shape what followed. The Babylonians, the Persians, and later the Greeks would all claim its legacy. Its discipline influenced their armies, its organization shaped their governments, and its libraries preserved knowledge older than Assyria itself. The tablets of Ashurbanipal survived the flames, buried beneath rubble. Centuries later, archaeologists uncovered them and found among the fragments the Epic of Gilgamesh, a story born in Sumer, carried through Babylon, and preserved in Assyria. The empire that conquered the world had unknowingly safeguarded the earliest human search for meaning. Every empire leaves something behind. Sumer left its rivers, Babylon left its walls, Assyria left its archives. The gods seemed to care less for who ruled the earth than for who remembered it. In the ruins of Nineveh, archaeologists found the final messages of Assyria, prayers written as the fires rose, not for victory, not for vengeance, for mercy. One scribe wrote, "The gods have turned their faces, but we will write their names until the end." His words, hardened by flame, survived the empire that silenced him. The weight of the crown was not power itself. It was the cost of forgetting why power existed. The Sumerians had built for the gods. The Babylonians built for memory. The Assyrians built for dominion, and all returned to dust. The Tigris continued its slow journey toward the sea, carrying fragments of brick, bone, and story. Each ripple a reminder that power, no matter how absolute, cannot escape the patient memory of the river, the eternal witness to the rise and fall of humankind.
When the last cigarette crumbled into the desert winds, it was not an end but a silence. The pause between heartbeats when history forgets to breathe. The rivers still flowed, but slower, as if reluctant to remember. The priests no longer sang, and the scribes no longer pressed their marks into clay. The Sumerians, who had taught the world to speak in symbols, fell into a sleep deeper than death, a silence that lasted millennia. The empires that followed mistook this quiet for their own beginning. The Akkadians rose from the north, speaking a tongue born from conquest rather than clay. They entered Sumer's empty temples and lit fires before the same gods, though they called them by new names. The title King of Kish, older than memory, still echoed through their proclamations, a borrowed legitimacy drawn from the land of the first kings. And so the Sumerians lived on, not in body, but in imitation. The Akkadians adopted their myths and measures, their ways of prayer and law. The Babylonians followed, building their own brilliance upon Sumer's foundations. They restored cities like Urg and Eridu, and traced their lineage back to a forgotten people they could no longer name. As the Sumerian language faded from daily life, it survived in the sacred realm. By the time of Hammurabi, it was no longer spoken in markets, but chanted in temples by priests who no longer understood the words. It became holy, precisely because it was dead. Each new empire believed itself the first to tame chaos. but all walked a path carved by Sumerian feet. The gods changed faces, the cities changed names, but the structure remained. Yet as centuries passed, the memory of Sumer dimmed. By the reign of Assyria, the name itself had vanished. To the Babylonians they became the people before the flood. To the Persians they were spirits of the deep south. To the Greeks they were legends. The oldest truth in the world had become an echo without a name. But some legacies survive forgetting. The Sumerians had invented not only writing but the idea that knowledge could be recorded and preserved. In that thought, they transcended their own mortality. Their spirit remained as foundation rather than presence. Beneath every law code, beneath every city grid, beneath every astronomical chart, lay their invisible hand. They taught the world how to count, how to plan, and how to pray. Their clay tablets became the bedrock of every empire that followed. When Urg finally fell, the poets wrote laments for the dead city, verses that mourned not only its stones, but the end of something greater, a people wandering in ashes and a city turned to dust beneath their feet. That lament became prophecy, for humanity wandered in those ashes for centuries, building and rebuilding across the same sacred ground. 3,000 years after Sumer's fall, the desert stirred. Winds that had buried the temples uncovered them, grain by grain. Cities like Urg and Eridu and Lagash rose again through the sand. Their broken columns whispered to the earth, and then came the men who could listen. In the 19th century, explorers entered Mesopotamia, seeking biblical ruins, but what they found was older. Beneath the dust of Babylon they uncovered tablets marked with the first human writing. The earliest find was simple, a merchant's receipt recording grain and sheep, yet it was the first true memory fixed in matter. Soon they uncovered temples turned to silence, libraries turned to clay, and hymns older than any known story. They uncovered a world that had shaped every kingdom after it. It was Henry Rawlinson who first decoded the wedge-shaped script on the cliffs of Behistun. When he recognized the underlying language as Sumerian, the world gasped. The people before the flood were not myth, but the missing beginning of history. Through their rediscovered words, the modern world found itself reflected. The tablets revealed mathematics and medicine, astronomy and law, charms and poems. They charted planets, measured time, sang hymns, and told stories of gods who loved, grieved, and judged. They wrote laws that held kings to account, and epics that questioned death itself. At the center of their rediscovered world lay the Epic of Gilgamesh, humanity's oldest surviving story, a king who sought eternal life and found instead the truth of mortality. The same truth that would echo through every empire, that glory fades but remembrance endures. Modern scholars realized how deeply Sumer still lived within the world. Every measure of time, the 60 seconds and 60 minutes, was theirs. The geometry of cities, the architecture of temples, the logic of law, all descended from their inventions. The rediscovery shook the foundations of Western thought. For centuries people believed civilization began with Greece, that philosophy was born with Socrates and law with Rome. But beneath the sands lay proof that the human mind had already dreamed of these things 5,000 years earlier. Even the flood myth, long tied to scripture, appeared first in Sumer, with a survivor who built a boat and birds sent to seek land. What the archaeologists uncovered was not only history, but humanity's oldest wound, the reminder that even the greatest civilization can fade into silence. Their fall was not due to invasion but exhaustion, the slow erosion of belief and soil and river. To rediscover Sumer was to rediscover the fragility of civilization itself, yet their beauty was not in their fall but in their persistence.
Their ideas lived beneath the world like roots. Their myths became archetypes. Their measures became systems. Their language became the spine of writing itself. In the ruins of Urg, archaeologists found small tablets made by apprentices learning to write: a reed, a river, a house, a god. They were exercises in becoming human. Even now, every child who learns to write continues that lineage. Perhaps this is Sumer's true immortality, not its kings or its temples, but its whisper in every written word, the invention of memory itself. When the first museum displayed the tablets, visitors stood in silence. There were no jewels or crowns, only clay, fragile and cracked. Yet those fragments carried more power than any throne. They were proof that thought itself could survive time. In those symbols, humanity rediscovered not only the origins of civilization, but the origins of itself, the same fear of oblivion, and the same yearning for meaning. The Sumerians had not built to last, they had built to be remembered, and in that, they succeeded. Their empire became dust, but their words became the dust's echo. And in that echo, quiet and enduring, civilization continues to hear itself remember.
When Babylon fell in 539 BCE, it did not fall violently. The transition happened quietly, almost administratively. The city had grown tired of political instability under its last king, Nabonidus, whose religious policies had alienated much of the priesthood and population. When Cyrus of Persia approached, the city did not resist. The gates were opened, and his forces entered without battle. Cyrus did not present himself as a conqueror. He adopted the role of restorer. He reinstated local religious practices, returned displaced peoples to their homelands, and emphasized continuity rather than disruption. In Babylonian inscriptions, he referred to himself as chosen by Marduk, aligning his rule with existing expectations of kingship. This was a change from earlier imperial transitions. Assyria had ruled through fear and direct control. Babylon had ruled through centralized religion and law. Persia ruled through delegation and administration. Babylon became a regional center within a much larger empire that stretched from the Mediterranean to Central Asia. Daily life did not change immediately. Farmers continued irrigation on canals first dug in Sumerian times. Scribes continued to write in cuneiform, recording harvests, contracts, astronomical observations, and government orders. The structure of urban life remained stable. The difference was that Babylon was no longer the political center of the Near East. It was now one of many important provincial cities. The Persians established a communication system that linked the entire empire. Roads, courier stations, and standardized weights and measures created a level of administrative connectivity not seen before. Aramaic became the primary language of bureaucracy, though Akkadian and Sumerian continued in scholarly and religious contexts. Temples remained active, and priests continued their duties, though their influence was diminished. The gods were still honored, but religion no longer determined state power. Babylonian astronomy flourished under Persian rule. Scholars continued to document the movement of stars and planets, creating records that would later influence Greek and Indian astronomy. Over time, Babylon experienced gradual decline. Canals silted, agricultural output decreased, and urban maintenance weakened. Changes in river flow made some neighborhoods difficult to supply. The ziggurat of Etemenanki, the great temple tower, was no longer fully maintained. Its reconstruction was attempted multiple times but was never completed. The city did not collapse, it slowly eroded. Babylon revolted twice during the Persian period. These uprisings were brief and unsuccessful. After the second rebellion was suppressed, sections of the city walls were dismantled. Babylon's political autonomy ended definitively. From then on it remained a cultural and economic center, but not a sovereign one. In 331 BCE, Alexander of Macedon entered Babylon after defeating Darius III. Like Cyrus before him, he was welcomed rather than resisted. Alexander respected Babylonian scholarship and religion. He ordered restoration of the temples and expressed interest in making Babylon the capital of his empire. His death in the city in 323 BCE prevented those plans from being realized. After Alexander, Babylon became contested territory among his successors. New cities were founded nearby, including Seleucia on the Tigris, which diverted population and trade away from Babylon. By the late Hellenistic period, Babylon's political and economic role had largely transferred to these new urban centers. Its lands were repurposed for agriculture, and many of its buildings fell into disuse. The use of cuneiform continued for several centuries more, primarily among temple scholars who maintained astronomical diaries and ritual calendars. However, Greek and Aramaic writing gradually replaced it. The last known cuneiform tablet, an astronomical record, dates to around 75 CE. After that, the script ceased to be used. A writing tradition that had existed for over 3,000 years ended quietly. Yet the knowledge developed in Mesopotamia did not disappear. It was transmitted through cultural continuity rather than political continuity. Babylonian astronomical data influenced Greek science, especially through centers of learning in Seleucia and later in Alexandria. Mathematics based on the base 60 system continued to be used in geometry and timekeeping. The region later became part of the Parthian and then the Sasanian empires. The old cities declined further, but trade and population continued. After the rise of Islam in the 7th century CE, the region became known as Al-Iraq. New cities such as Ctesiphon and later Baghdad became centers of administration and learning. Baghdad, founded in the 8th century, became one of the most significant intellectual centers in world history. In its libraries and academies, scholars translated and studied texts from Greece, Persia, India, and Mesopotamia. Knowledge that originated in Sumer and Babylon was integrated into Islamic science, mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. Through trade and translation, it eventually entered Europe during the Middle Ages and Renaissance. By this point, the names Sumer and Akkad had been forgotten, their histories replaced by oral memory and scattered references in literature. The ruins of their cities remained visible but unrecognized. Travelers noted mounds of bricks and fragments of walls, but their origins were unknown. In the 19th century, archaeological expeditions began in Mesopotamia. Excavations at sites such as Nineveh, Babylon, Uri, and Uruk uncovered vast archives of clay tablets. Scholars deciphered cuneiform beginning with the Behistun inscription, recognizing that the script represented multiple languages, including Akkadian and the older Sumerian. This rediscovery reshaped historical understanding. It became clear that the earliest urban civilization, with writing, law, astronomy, administration, and organized religion, emerged not in Greece or Egypt, but in southern Mesopotamia, more than 5,000 years earlier. The silent rebellion of Mesopotamia was not a political uprising. It was the survival of knowledge beyond the fall of the states that produced it. Empires rose and fell, but the systems they built, written law, recorded history, astronomical calculation, administrative planning, continued. This continuity did not depend on kings or temples.
It depended on scribes, farmers, merchants, and teachers who maintained the patterns of daily life. Civilization persisted because ordinary people preserved it through consistent practice. The legacy of Mesopotamia is not its monuments, which have largely collapsed. It is the structure of civilization itself: writing, urban planning, legal codes, mathematics, and the practice of recording knowledge so it can be transmitted across generations. Empires fade, languages change, cities fall, but systems endure, and in those systems the first civilizations remain present, even when their names are forgotten.
By the 5th century BCE, the Near East was undergoing a long transformation as the age of divine kingship slowly gave way to systems built on administration, written law, and structured governance. The Persian Achaemenid Empire embodied this shift. Its rulers no longer declared themselves gods. They presented themselves as stewards of order who governed a vast realm from Persepolis across territories stretching from the Indus Valley to the Mediterranean. Their authority rested on a disciplined administrative structure divided into satrapies overseen by governors, supported by standardized taxation, codified laws, and a sophisticated network of roads that enabled the empire to function smoothly. The Royal Road, maintained with relay stations operating day and night, allowed information to move faster than in any empire before it. This model marked a significant departure from earlier states that relied on the personal charisma or divine status of individual kings. Although the Achaemenid rulers retained religious legitimacy through Zoroastrian principles that emphasized truth, order, and cosmic balance, their power was rooted in stability and administration rather than the claim to divine identity. At the same time, another transformation was developing to the west. In the Greek city-states, particularly Athens, discussions about politics, ethics, and the nature of authority began to shift away from religious explanations. Philosophers questioned how societies should be governed, what role law should play, and how reason could guide decision-making. These ideas spread gradually, influencing political thought across the Mediterranean. The encounter between Persia and Greece through the Persian Wars, fought between 499 and 449 BCE, brought two worlds into direct contact. While Persia sought to maintain influence in Asia Minor, Greek resistance fostered a new sense of identity. Although the wars did not end Persian power, they marked the beginning of Greece's rise as a political and cultural force. In the 4th century BCE, Alexander of Macedon unified the Greek states and marched eastward, defeating Darius III in battles such as Issus and Gaugamela. The Persian administrative system collapsed under his advance, and he inherited an empire rather than destroyed one. Alexander adopted Persian customs, married into Persian nobility, and encouraged a blending of Greek and Near Eastern cultures in his vision of a unified empire. But his sudden death in Babylon in 323 BCE halted this plan. Without a successor, his generals divided the territories into kingdoms such as the Seleucid Empire in Mesopotamia and the Ptolemaic Kingdom in Egypt. Despite changes in leadership, many Persian and earlier Mesopotamian administrative practices endured. Greek influence spread through art, education, and governance, but local traditions persisted. In Mesopotamia, temples remained active, astronomers continued recording celestial movements as they had for more than 1,000 years, and cuneiform writing survived in scholarly and religious settings. Meanwhile, Rome expanded westward, Initially a city-state built on elected magistrates, a senate, and codified law, Rome extended its authority throughout Italy and into the Mediterranean. When it encountered the Hellenistic kingdoms, it absorbed their territories and adopted many of their administrative practices. Roman governance relied on written law, organized military logistics, and a network of roads and standardized systems that echoed methods pioneered in earlier Near Eastern empires. Even after civil wars weakened the Roman Republic, and Augustus emerged as the first emperor, he portrayed himself not as a divine king, but as guardian of republican values, reinforcing a shift toward authority rooted in legal and institutional continuity. In the East, the Parthians rose as successors to the Seleucids, maintaining Persian administrative traditions while resisting Greek cultural dominance. They controlled trade routes, linking the Mediterranean to Central Asia. Later, the Sasanian Empire replaced Parthian rule and revived many Achaemenid practices, emphasizing centralized authority and Zoroastrian state religion. The frontier between Rome and Persia became a zone where conflict and exchange were constant. Along these routes, Greek philosophical works, Persian administrative strategies, and Babylonian astronomical records traveled and mingled. Cities such as Ctesiphon and Antioch became centers where cultures interacted and where knowledge moved more freely than armies. Throughout this period, intellectual traditions evolved. Greek and Roman thinkers debated ethics, logic, and natural science, while Persian scholars compiled astronomical and religious texts. Authority continued to shift from divine claims towards systems that relied on law, literacy, measurement, and inquiry. Yet even as these new structures grew, symbols of older kingship, crowns, ceremonies, titles, remained important because they carried the appearance of continuity and legitimacy. By the 3rd century CE, both Rome and Persia faced internal strain. Rome struggled with political instability and economic challenges, while Persia faced rivalries and threats from nomadic groups. Both empires survived through adaptation rather than collapse. In the 4th century, new religious movements reshaped political authority. Christianity spread through the Roman Empire, and when Constantine endorsed the religion, it provided a new source of unity and legitimacy. In Persia, Zoroastrianism continued to guide the connection between rulers and cosmic order. By this stage, the ancient idea of the divine king had nearly vanished. Authority now rested on administration, law, collective belief, and institutional continuity, rather than on the sacred identity of a single ruler. The transformation had taken nearly 2,000 years, evolving slowly through adaptation. Yet despite the changes in leadership, religion, and culture, the world remained tied to the foundations laid in ancient Mesopotamia. Systems such as written law, urban planning, timekeeping, record-keeping, and structured governance endured across centuries and empires. The twilight of kings was not a final ending, but a transition from leadership defined by divine identity to leadership defined by organized structure. The world moved forward with new frameworks of governance, yet remained connected to the old through the systems that persisted. The legacies of Sumer, Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome became part of a single continuous pattern. The shift from rule by sacred kings to rule by institutions, and through that gradual shift the foundations of civilization endured. When the ancient empires came to an end, their knowledge did not disappear with them. Power shifted, cities changed hands, and languages evolved, but the systems of writing, measurement, astronomy, and administration continued in new forms, the world entered a period in which preservation became as important as expansion. Instead of building new monuments to authority, many societies turned their attention to copying, maintaining, and organizing the knowledge that had been inherited from earlier civilizations. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century CE, Europe entered a period of political fragmentation. Many cities declined, trade slowed, and large institutions collapsed. However, in monasteries across Italy, Gaul, Britain, and Ireland, small groups of monks began the slow work of copying texts. They preserved Latin literature, fragments of Greek philosophy, and summaries of scientific observations. The environment was modest. The work was steady rather than innovative, but without it, much of the written memory of the classical world would have been lost. These scribes did not attempt to expand the boundaries of knowledge. Their role was simply to maintain what remained. In this respect, they were continuing a tradition that stretched back to the scribes of Sumer and Babylon, the idea that memory could be stabilized through writing. While Western Europe focused on preservation, the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, remained more connected to the older intellectual traditions. Constantinople continued to function as a center of administration, trade, and scholarship. Its scholars retained access to Greek texts that had vanished elsewhere. They copied and annotated works of mathematics, medicine, and philosophy. Byzantine courts and schools maintained an educational framework based on classical logic and rhetoric. Although the empire faced military pressures, the continuity of learning persisted. Further east, the Sasanian Empire in Persia played a similar role. It inherited administrative and cultural practices from the earlier Achaemenid and Parthian periods. Cities such as Ctesiphon and Dundishapur became centers for scientific and medical research. Scholars there studied anatomy, astronomy, and mathematics. They translated Greek and Indian scientific texts into Middle Persian and Syriac. The exchange of knowledge across languages continued as part of organized state support. In the 7th century, the political landscape changed again with the expansion of Islamic rule. Arab armies conquered territories across the Near East, incorporating Syria, Egypt, and Persia. The new leadership did not dismantle the educational institutions they encountered. Instead, they preserved and reorganized them. The Quran emphasized the value of learning, and the early caliphate supported scholars who collected and translated the older scientific and philosophical texts. By the 8th century, Baghdad had emerged as a major intellectual center, founded in 762 CE. It was planned as an administrative capital and quickly grew into a hub of scholarship. Under the Abbasid caliphs, particularly Al-Ma'mun, the state supported a large-scale translation movement. The most well-known institution of this effort was the Beit al-Hikmah, or House of Wisdom. Scholars from different regions and religious backgrounds worked together to translate works from Greek, Syriac, Persian, and Sanskrit into Arabic. This translation movement did more than preserve knowledge, it standardized it. Mathematical terminology was refined, medical procedures were recorded systematically, astronomical tables were corrected and expanded. Scholars such as al-Khwarizmi developed algebra as a formal system. Others like Hunayn Dafai bin Ishaq organized medical knowledge into consistent reference works. Astronomers such as al-Batani improved observational accuracy beyond what earlier civilizations had recorded. The methods used in Baghdad reflected older Mesopotamian practices: measurement, calculation, and systematic recording. But the scale was new.
knowledge was being treated as a shared resource rather than the property of one state or priesthood. As this work expanded, similar centers developed across the Islamic world. Cairo became a center for medical scholarship. Samarkand and Bukhara became centers for mathematical and astronomical research. In Al-Andalus, on the Iberian Peninsula, the city of Córdoba developed one of the largest libraries of the medieval world. Scholars in these cities translated and commented on earlier works, producing new summaries and treatises that organized knowledge logically and accessibly. By the 10th century, the scientific tradition of the Islamic world had become the principal means through which ancient knowledge was preserved and expanded. Figures such as Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina, and Al-Biruni wrote extensive works on logic, medicine, physics, and mathematics. Their texts circulated widely, copied across regions and referenced by later scholars. Meanwhile, in Western Europe, intellectual activity remained limited until the 11th and 12th centuries, when contact with Islamic Spain and Sicily reintroduced many of the texts that had been preserved and expanded in Baghdad and other centers. Translators in Toledo and other cities began to convert Arabic texts into Latin. This process made the works of Aristotle, Euclid, Ptolemy, and Galen accessible to European scholars once more. By this stage, however, the texts had passed through several layers of commentary and revision, reflecting contributions from Persian, Syrian, and Arab scholars. This transmission of knowledge played a key role in the development of European universities in the 12th and 13th centuries. Schools in Paris, Bologna, and Oxford adopted many of the same methods of classification and inquiry that had been used in the House of Wisdom. Aristotle's logic returned to the center of philosophical debate. Medical practice followed the structures outlined in Ibn Sina's Canon of Medicine. Mathematical instruction relied on algebraic notation derived from Al-Khwarizmi. Knowledge now moved across boundaries more freely than power did. Even when political states declined, the systems of learning they supported continued through written transmission. The fall of a capital city no longer meant the collapse of its intellectual tradition. In 1258, the Mongol conquest of Baghdad destroyed many of the physical centers of scholarship. Libraries, observatories, and administrative archives were damaged or lost. However, by this time, the core texts of the preceding centuries had already spread outward. Cairo, Damascus, Tabriz, and Córdoba continued to teach and copy them. In Europe, they had already begun to shape learning in monastic schools and early universities. The legacy of this long chain of preservation, translation, and refinement influenced the developments that later became known as the Renaissance. The architectural, mathematical, and scientific achievements of the 15th and 16th centuries in Europe were not independent rediscoveries. They were the continuation of a process that began thousands of years earlier in Mesopotamia, was preserved in Persia and Byzantium, systematized in Baghdad, and transmitted through Spain and Sicily. The last architects of time were not a single group or culture. They were the scribes, translators, teachers, and scholars who ensured that knowledge continued across periods of disruption. They did not build monuments of stone. They built continuity through writing, teaching, and classification. Their work demonstrated a principle that has shaped all of recorded history. Civilizations rise and fall, but knowledge endures when it is copied, taught, and passed forward. The survival of understanding depends less on power than on memory.
The history of civilization begins in the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The earliest cities grew from their banks, and from those cities came writing, administration, astronomy, and law. The people who lived there, the Sumerians, were not the first humans, but they were among the first to develop a system for recording thought in a permanent form. That act changed the direction of history. The Sumerians used clay tablets and a reed stylus to create cuneiform. With it they recorded trade, laws, hymns, medical observations and stories. By writing they preserved information across generations. This allowed knowledge to accumulate rather than be lost. Civilization became something that could be maintained and improved. The system they created influenced the Akkadians, who absorbed their language and administration. It shaped the Babylonians, who developed mathematical astronomy and codified law. It continued through the Assyrians, who organized empire on a scale the world had not seen before. And it remained in use during the Persian period, when the region became part of a larger administrative network that extended across continents. Even when the language of Sumer was no longer spoken, it was still taught in schools as a scholarly and religious language. Writing traditions do not depend on population, they depend on continuity of education. This continuity allowed Sumerian knowledge to survive long after the civilization itself declined. The transition from clay tablets to parchment and paper did not erase the earlier accomplishments. The system of counting minutes and hours in base 60 comes directly from Mesopotamia. The division of circles into 360 degrees follows the same logic. These measurements shaped astronomy, navigation, architecture, and eventually global science. When the ancient empires ended, the knowledge they carried was not lost completely. In Europe, monks copied surviving texts. In Byzantium, Greek and Roman works remained in circulation. In Persia and the early Islamic world, scholars collected, translated, and evaluated scientific and philosophical texts. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad created new mathematics and preserved older works. These materials later reached Spain and Sicily, where they were translated into Latin. Through this chain of preservation, the ideas of ancient Mesopotamia entered medieval Europe and contributed to the intellectual developments that followed. The continuity of knowledge across time is not direct or unbroken. Each period of history selects, interprets, and reshapes what it inherits. The Sumerian flood story became part of Babylonian mythology, then Hebrew scripture, and then later religious traditions. The mathematics of Babylonian astronomy became the basis for Greek geometric astronomy, which in turn shaped the models used in the Islamic world and eventually in Europe. The form changed, but the underlying principles remained. Civilization moves forward, not by preserving everything, but by preserving the structures that allow knowledge to be transmitted. Writing systems, educational traditions and methods of measurement are more durable than monuments. The ziggurats of Sumer are ruins now, but the timekeeping system first recorded there regulates global clocks. The first complete written story we know, the Epic of Gilgamesh, examines the limits of human life. Its central theme is not conquest, but the recognition that physical life ends while recorded memory does not. This perspective appears repeatedly throughout history. It reflects a consistent understanding that continuity is achieved through communication, education, and record-keeping rather than through power. Today, writing and information storage use digital systems instead of clay. The medium has changed, but the function has not. Data is stored, copied, and transmitted globally. The principle is the same as it was in ancient Mesopotamia, the attempt to ensure that ideas outlast the individual. If a person from ancient Sumer observed the modern world, they would not recognize the technologies, but they would recognize the purpose behind them. They would understand libraries, archives, schools, and research institutions. They would recognize the attempt to measure time, to map the heavens, to document transactions, and to create stories that explain existence. The tools have changed,
but the motivations have not. The legacy of Sumer is not a specific set of beliefs or monuments. It is the concept that knowledge can be organized, taught, and preserved. Every society that came afterward built upon this idea. Egypt used stone inscriptions, Greece used philosophy, Rome used law, the Islamic world used translation, and since the modern world uses digital storage. All of these developments rely on the same fundamental insight, that memory can be extended beyond the human lifespan through recorded information. Civilizations rise and fall for many reasons: environmental change, economic stress, political conflict, but ideas can persist beyond these changes if they are written down and passed forward. That is why the story of Sumer is not simply a beginning, it is a foundation. The continuity that began in the cities of the two rivers continues in the systems that structure modern life. The calendars we follow, the mathematics we use, the practice of writing itself, all carry elements of that early framework. Civilization is not defined by buildings or rulers but by the preservation and transmission of knowledge. The Sumerians did not know that their work would influence thousands of years of history. They wrote to meet practical needs, accounting, administration, religious record, yet the system they developed outlasted their cities, their language, and their culture. It became part of the shared human inheritance. This is the lasting thread that connects past and present, the effort to understand, record, and communicate experience. The tools have changed, but the purpose remains constant. Civilization continues as long as knowledge is preserved and taught. The breath of the ancient world remains in the systems we use every day, in writing, in measurement, in the structure of thought. The first civilization did not end, it became part of all that came after. The story continues.
Our journey for tonight has come to a close, but the stories of the past continue to drift quietly through time. If you are awake, thank you for listening. If you have fallen asleep, rest peacefully. This is Ages Rewoven, where history becomes a soft place to dream. Until next time, good night.